It is that lavender time of year. Hello, little bees. I am so happy you guys are enjoying these beautiful flowers. So we're going to be distilling some lavender today. My bees are loving the flowers. I'm certainly loving the flowers. I think I'll leave some of these for these wonderful bees. Let them do their thing. And it's been 2 years now since I've been doing this with the distillation process. So let's go ahead and get started showing you guys what I have learned over the last 2 years. Have a wonderful day, little bee. So this is the pot I've had for 2 years. So this is how it came. It came with your nozzle with a rubber attachment, so that way you can manipulate it and move it around. Your copper coil with your condensing pot. It comes with 2 rubber hoses. They're not very long. They only go, maybe 2 feet at the most. Then you get your pressure gauge, your temperature gauge, and that's how it attaches underneath. And then you get your stock pot. So this is the biggest thing I've learned with this, and probably the hardest part of this whole unit is managing your coil pot, your condensing pot. First of all, it's much easier to run this thing inside because you can run a line from your sink to fill it, and then you also can run a separate line to your drain, so that way it's constantly filling and draining at the same time for you. So this is a big deal. Here's the other part of the thing. When your pot has some water in it and you have it on the stove, it's going to boil steam, and your coil is going to catch all of that steam. Now, steam is very, very hot, especially when it's cycling through copper coils and attaching through there. So that way, when it comes out, hopefully the goal is you get a distillate instead of vapor. And that's where the connection between these two comes in handy. So your pot holds cold water. The cold water is supposed to cool your coils. That way, all the steam that comes up from your pot into your coils will cool and condense, and then you get your distillate, your liquid distillates, out your spout. However, if your pot is empty, your coils will stay hot, and then all you'll have coming out the end is vapor. And once that happens, all your essential oils, your hydrosol, it's gone for good. It's never coming back. It's gone. So you want to make sure you keep your coils cool. So this is perhaps the biggest problem with this whole thing, is you have your water coming in and you have your water going out. If your water is draining faster than it's filling up, your coils will overheat and they will just produce the vapor. They won't condense. You won't get liquid out the bottom. You'll end up with vapor that vanishes, goes away, disappears for good. But if your pot is filling faster than it's draining, then you have a big mess all over your stove. So you want to make sure you have the same amount of water coming in as you do going out. I ended up adding a valve to help manage that a little bit better. But here's the other problem. If the water isn't coming in fast enough and out fast enough, the coils will eventually heat up the water. If the water is hot and your coil is hot, then you still have the same problem. Vapor, gone for good. So, you need to keep the cycling fast, but keep the water level constant. So that way your water stays cool, so your coil will condense, and then you end up with distillate. So that is the hugest problem, is this pot right here. That is your thing you want to manage the most, at least for this type of unit. Now, when I use this pot, I fill it up all the way with herbs, and I only use a little bit of water. I mean, not very much, maybe 2-3 cups of water for this whole pot. The reason is, the oils is going to come from your plants, not the water. Your water is going to help facilitate the vaporization of everything, so that way it'll come out your end, and then you'll get your distillate. But if you want a good quality hydrosol coming out of this thing, the less water to more plants that you have, the stronger the scent and the higher quality your hydrosol is going to be. But when this is on the stove and everything's locked up, you cannot see how much water is in this thing. So when your spout starts to slow down and is dripping, you want to make sure you pull your pot off the stove. If you don't, then the bottom of your pot will start to burn, and this thing will do some weird stuff. I tell you, it'll start moving around on you, and this thing can be like a pressurized bomb, and you definitely don't want that. So pay attention to how much distillate is coming out. Once it slows down, take your pot off the stove. It is much better you take it off sooner than later, because then you can check your water level without burning your pot and possibly blowing up your kitchen. Another thing, make sure that your water level is staying constant all the time. If it's getting too hot, you'll end up with vapor and you won't hear it dripping. If it is draining too fast, you will still end up with vapor and you won't hear it dripping. If it starts to fill too fast, you'll hear it bubbling. This will start to bubble at the very, very top. That's your warning, it's starting to overflow. So pay attention. Make sure that it starts to draining. If you can, suction off some water off the top, maybe that'll help. Plug the line, something, to keep it from overflowing, because it'll make a mess. So manage your coil pot for sure. Pay attention to the distillate and watch how this thing is running. That is the biggest thing I have learned with this unit so far in working with it. And I'm going to go ahead and get started on distilling some lavender. Alright, we've got our lavender heads cut off, all the flowers. We've got our stems over here. The stems I can use to make smudge sticks and dry it and make all kinds of cool stuff with this. But this is where we're going to get most of our essential oil from for the lavender. So let's go ahead and put it in the pot and get started. This is where having several cups of water or even a gallon of water handy just to stand by is really helpful, because sometimes you might need a little extra water for some things, and if your sink is occupied, then it makes it difficult to try and run water if you need it for your coil pot. I'm just going to go ahead and fill this up with my lavender blossoms. Pretty much the same process as the first video, if you guys have taken the time to see that. This is kind of a more updated version. So I'm going to leave a little bit of space at the top. Not a whole lot, but leaving just a little bit of room does help if sometimes my pot overheats, that sometimes the plant matter doesn't bubble back up through my coils, which you definitely don't want to have happen. So having a little bit of space does kind of help prevent some of that. I'm going to go ahead and lock this down and get it going on the stove. So we have got our coil pot filling up with cold water. It's also draining. It seems to be fairly consistent on the water level, but it's not quite high enough to cover those coils. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a little bit more cold water to the top. And this will help prime it, so that way the coils stay cool, as much of the coil as I possibly can stay cool. And then, so here, I don't know if you can see a little bit of the vapor coming out, so we should have some distillate coming out here pretty soon. Just got to get those coils to cool off a little bit more. Sometimes you can add a little bit of ice to the top if you need it to cool down faster. Come on, you can do it. You can cool off. So all that vapor stuff I'm not going to be able to get back. Now once it starts dripping, I'm going to pay attention to the color, because if it is extremely dark, then I know my pot is too hot, my main stock pot, and then I need to cool it off. There we go. So that's the cold water finally cooling off those coils. So now I don't have vapor coming out the end. I've got that distillate. So if my main pot is too hot, then the distillate will actually turn out kind of brown and dirty, and you definitely don't want that. If it's really hot, then you'll have plant matter coming out through the coils as well, and that's really not a good thing. You can damage your pot doing that. So we want to make sure that the distillate stays relatively clear. If it's a tiny bit cloudy, that's okay too, but for the most part you want to try and have that be as clear as possible. You hear it making puttering noises. But this is how it goes, and I'll wait until about this much fluid, about this orange cup. So I put about that much in. I'm not going to get that much out. So you will lose a little bit because it does sometimes vaporize it out. So when I have about this much water that I'd put in come out, then I'm going to go ahead and stop it, take it off the stove, and then work with what I've got, and then re-prime my pot all over again. You can see a little bit of that oil sitting on top of that water. And the reason that happens is because the water is so much more dense than the oil, so the oil will float on the top. So that will be your essential oil and hydrosol separation there. It's kind of cool. Pulled this still off the stove because it is about done. I've got about the amount of water that I put into my pot back out. You can see the layer of essential oil on the top. That's that lighter color ring in there, and then I have the water. So I will be dumping this out, but I need to pull the top off now. I've just already removed everything. And then all of that steam is what goes up in that tube right there. So that is where all of that distillate comes from, is that steam that's in that pot. And that's what this coil does catch. So now I'm going to set this aside. It's really super hot. So you want to make sure you have some kind of gloves when doing this. Another thing, this doesn't have safety handles on there, so having gloves is quite helpful. I've got a strainer here ready, so I'm going to see if I have any water that's still at the bottom of the pot, and it looks like I have a little bit. Dumping that out carefully. This is still really hot. So that's all the water that was left in the pot. That's kind of basically like lavender tea. Yes, lavender is edible, but we'll be using that water to put back in our pot and processing another batch of lavender, and we'll go ahead and do this all again. When I empty my distillate pot, I go ahead and I like using these kind of containers because you can drain the hydrosol off, and then that oil level kind of drops, and it makes it much easier to extract that oil off the top of that hydrosol. So I'm just going to go ahead and pour that in there. I'm going to go ahead and seal the top back up, so I don't want any of that to evaporate back out. And that distillate will cool. You can still see the essential oil there, and from there on down is all of that hydrosol. The most time-consuming part of this, making your essential oil, is straining it off and separating it. You want to make sure that you separate all the hydrosol from your essential oil, because if you leave any water at all in your oil, it can actually make your oil not last quite as long. So I'm going to go ahead and try and pop this top off. And because the oil is not as dense as the water, it just kind of floats on top. But you can see it's got a layer of debris there. It's got some plant matter in there. All that stuff has to be strained out and cleaned, so that way you end out with a very clear and very nice looking oil. So I'm just going to quickly tip this upside down. There we go. And be very careful not to squeeze anything. Okay, so this way you can actually just gently remove that water off the bottom. If you have some way that you can punch like a hole in a container to where that water or that hydrosol can drain off, that makes this process a little bit easier. But again, this process here is the most time-consuming part because you are trying to save as much oil as you possibly can while still having the best quality possible. Just gonna let it do its thing, bubble up, so that way I don't accidentally end out with oil trying to drain out with the water. Sometimes if you let it settle, it helps that process along. So again, because I've already condensed this so far, I'm just trying to get the very, very last bit of the water out. This process takes a little bit longer than it otherwise normally does. If you haven't seen the video where I take apart a dropper bottle with a dropper cap apart, you're gonna maybe want to review that because these things do come apart in 3 pieces. This is what I did for my filter, is I just used the ring, just the ring on the cap on that, and then I put a coffee filter in there. So put a coffee filter up over the top of your bottle and then seal it in place with your ring. And this really does help to drain off the last of the water because the water and the oil will not mix, and that's why it separates there. I could use this at this point to then squeeze my bottle and then I can't squeeze anymore, so everything else that's in there is either just a few drops of water and then the rest of it's oil. So we'll take a good look. And yeah, so we've got just a few little water droplets at the bottom and the rest of that is oil. Now you will lose a little bit of oil in your hydrosol. That's gonna happen. Expect it. But then your hydrosol is gonna be really, really nice. So it won't really matter so much if you have a little bit of oil in there, because when you start to filter everything out, your hydrosol will end up being very, very clear instead of this cloudy color, and everything comes back out of it. But so this is what we got. And now I need to change the filter so then I can purify my essential oil. This is the part that I thought really, really sucked. If you press too hard on your bottle, you will actually break the coffee filter and then you have to start over. And you definitely don't want to do that. So I'm just going to go ahead and just squeeze very gently. Better not have popped a hole in there. I'm just going to keep doing this until all of that oil comes out. And that is some of the impurities that came out of it. That filter's pretty icky gross, but my oil is still not as clear as it needs to be, so I need to repeat this process over again about 4 or 5 times, and then it should be alright. I have 2 vials here of my hydrosol. So this is before filtration and this is after filtration. This still has some trace essential oils in there. Also, what can happen that will affect your clarity is how hot your pot was at the time when you distilled this. So you are going to need to filter it afterwards so it will come out really, really clear. I've got a candle here so you can kind of tell just how cloudy that really is, and then just how clear the hydrosol is once you get it filtered. This took about, I'm going to say 10 times filtering it through a coffee filter, and I double layered it so I could get a really good clarity on it. So you can get it from being cloudy to absolutely crystal clear through filtering it out. And again, I just used a coffee filter, kind of like what you saw me do for my essential oils, because it works really, really well. Here is my full collection of essential oil that I distilled this year, and I had to do it. This took me about 4 days. So this was day 1, day 2, day 3, and day 4. This came off of my first plant, off of one of my plants. I didn't quite get as much as I'd hoped I would, but some years are going to be like that. We had a bunch of snow this year. This came off of my second plant. Again, I got a little bit more oil in there compared to my first plant, but not quite as much as I had hoped. So I was really kind of worried that I was not going to get as much oil as I actually did. All 3 of these vials came off of my third plant, but I had to do them in 2 different days. So this was the first part of that third plant, and then this was the second part of that third plant. If you look, there is a color difference in the oil where this one is darker than this one. That happened because on this third day, my pot was a little bit hotter. The day was a little bit different as well, weather-wise, for distilling. So things, environmental changes, when you harvest your flowers can also change the color of your oils, how hot your pot is. All of those things make a difference in how your finished oil comes out. But again, all of these oils came from the exact type of plant, so I can go ahead and mix these and everything will be fine. No one will know the difference. But I just wanted to show you guys what I have learned in the process of making my own essential oils, and that heat does play a factor in how your finished oil will respond. And again, this was off of the same plant, but because these were done on a different day and it was hotter and my pot was hotter, the oil is darker compared to this. So if you notice those differences in your oil, that might be the cause on what is making it darker. For those who are interested, I do not sell my essential oils, but I do sell my Hydrosol. This is a 30 milliliter glass bottle, and it's super filtered. It is super clear, and it does come with a dropper cap, and it does come in a sealed container as well, so that makes it easier for you. Now this works great as a facial toner. It is amazing to help even remove pet odors. It also removes smoke damage in clothing and furniture, which is super cool. We discovered that by accident one day, because fire is not fun. But when it does happen, it happens, and this helped tremendously with removing any of those odors as well. Great for skin. You can add this to facial creams, lotions if you'd like to. It's just so versatile. It's got so many things that you can actually use it for. And again, it is undiluted, so how it comes out of my distiller after it's been super filtered is exactly what you're going to get. So again, if you are interested in purchasing the Hydrosol, make sure you go to my Facebook page and at Basic Homesteading and Survival. Make sure you order yourself one, because this is amazing stuff, and it does go very quickly. But this is everything that I've learned so far in the last couple years. So if you like this video, you can come back for more tips and tricks later on. Bye now.